From the first human footprints in African soil to boots on the moon, our story spans 200,000 years of triumph and tragedy. How did scattered bands of hunters transform into a global civilization connecting billions? Journey through humanity's greatest turning points. The first cities rising from Mesopotamian mud, empires stretching across continents, and revolutions that forever changed how we think, fight, and live. Witness the birth of religions that still shape our world, technologies that rebuilt society, and ideas that toppled kings. The choices our ancestors made echo through time, shaping everything about your life today. Their story is yours. Long before the first stones of a city were raised, or the first names carved into clay, humanity's story began beneath the African sun. In grasslands where acacia trees cast scattered shadows, bands of hunters and gatherers roamed, carrying with them little more than stone tools, fire, and a shared memory of ancestors whose footsteps reached back nearly 200,000 years. Here, in this cradle, modern Homo sapiens took shape. Their bodies adapted for endurance, their minds sharpened for cooperation and imagination. Across the Rift Valley, of volcanic soils preserved bones and tools that whisper of these beginnings. The humans who lived here were not isolated. They moved, traded mates, exchanged techniques, and over time, their camps left behind evidence of symbolic thought. Ochre used to mark skin, beads strung into ornaments, and burials that spoke of grief and meaning. Life was fragile, yet ideas had begun to outlast individual lives. Far from being solitary figures, people survived in small groups rarely larger than 50. Within these communities, ties of kinship and trust proved more reliable than stone blades. To keep such groups from fracturing, they relied on a balance of sharing and storytelling. Every successful hunt, every gathered root or fruit, was distributed so none would starve. The punishment for selfishness was not a prison sentence, but exclusion, a fate as deadly as any predator lurking in the savannah. Even in those early millennia, fire marked the boundary between human and beast. Flames were carried carefully from camp to camp, guarded like treasure, fed with dry grass and wood that children collected. Fire cooked meat, softened roots, and drove off prowling lions. Around the fire, speech flourished. Words, shaped by tongues and breath, bound people together, allowing hunters to plan and elders to teach. Knowledge moved from one mind to the next, generation after generation, creating continuity where otherwise there would have been only silence. Caves across Africa and Eurasia preserve the earliest art that testifies to this flowering of the human spirit. On rock walls, silhouettes of animals and hunters flicker in ochre and charcoal, scenes not meant only to describe, but to invoke. Perhaps they were prayers for success, perhaps lessons for children, or perhaps simple expressions of wonder at the world's beauty. Whatever their purpose, they reveal a shift. Humans no longer lived merely in the present moment, but sought to capture what was fleeting and render it permanent. Over tens of thousands of years, families and bands stretched their range beyond the African homeland. Coastal routes offered shellfish and fish to those willing to fashion hooks and nets, while inland river valleys promised fresh game and fertile grounds for gathering. Some crossed into Arabia when climates allowed, leaving footprints on ancient sands. Others pressed into Europe, following herds of mammoth and bison into icy landscapes where fire and clothing were no longer luxuries, but matters of survival. The spread of humanity was not a single march forward, but a web of movements, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating when climates shifted or resources failed. Glacial cycles opened and closed paths, forcing adaptability upon those who wished to endure. Knowledge of how to knap flint or weave baskets did not vanish with migration. It traveled hand to hand, voice to voice, shaping cultures across continents. This transfer, without writing, became humanity's first true inheritance. In the steppes of Central Asia, hunters tracked wild horses long before they thought to ride them. Along coasts of what would one day be Australia, fishers learned to manage tides and currents, steering rafts across dangerous waters. In Europe's frozen valleys, people carved ivory figurines that carried meaning into the heart of winter. Each innovation spread outward, not through markets or manuscripts, but through encounters, meetings between strangers, marriages between clans, exchanges born of necessity and curiosity alike. Only a modest population lived here, nothing like the crowded ages ahead. A valley that now sustains thousands once supported only a few families. Yet within these small circles, human imagination flourished. Myths were told beside fires. Stars became maps for journeys, and bones of the dead were arranged with care. These gestures reveal that people carried with them not only the struggle for food, but also a search for belonging in a universe that often seemed vast and hostile. The hunter's world was deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature. Movements of animals, ripening of fruits, and flow of rivers dictated survival more firmly than any human authority. There were no kings, no written laws, no walls to divide. Instead, there was memory and tradition. Elders recalled which plants healed and which poisoned, which tracks promised prey and which warned of danger. Their wisdom was the archive of the community, their voices its living library. Death was frequent, but so too was resilience. Infants often perished, hunters sometimes failed, and injuries could cripple. Yet despite these dangers, human groups spread and endured where other species faltered. Neanderthals, skilled hunters themselves, eventually faded from the stage, but not before mingling with newcomers. Traces of their blood remain in many people alive today. Silent testimony to encounters that were not always hostile, but sometimes intimate. This long Paleolithic era, spanning tens of millennia, unfolded with a rhythm unlike later ages. Change came slowly. A new tool type or hunting strategy might spread over centuries rather than decades. For the people themselves, however, each day required adaptation, courage, and cooperation. Every sunrise meant another chance to find food, another risk of predators, another opportunity for song, ritual, or rest. Among these small communities, hierarchy existed but remained fragile. A skilled hunter or persuasive storyteller might lead, yet authority could be questioned and power dissolved if it bred arrogance. This fluidity prevented tyranny, but also limited the scale of human organization. Only when groups swelled beyond the familiar threshold, roughly 150 people, the point at which memory alone could no longer hold the web of relationships, did pressures emerge for new forms of order. At the edge of forests or beside riverbanks, camps revealed the seeds of future transformations. Hunters experimented with encouraging plants to grow near their settlements, scattering seeds perhaps without full awareness of what they were beginning. Dogs, once wolves circling camps for scraps, became companions, hunters, and guardians. These subtle shifts foreshadowed revolutions yet to come, though those living through them could not have known the magnitude of what was stirring. People did not settle into stillness. They carried their journeys onward, into the Americas over frozen ground, and into the Pacific across scattered isles. Each new land brought challenges of climate, terrain, and unfamiliar beasts. In some places, like the lush valleys of South America, Abundance supported thriving bands. In others, such as the Arctic, survival demanded innovation in clothing, shelter, and diet that would test the limits of ingenuity. What endured through all these wanderings was the sense of community. The hearth fire, the shared hunt, the story told under stars. These were constants that bound people together across vast distances and epochs. Whether in Africa's savannas, Europe's icy plains, or Asia's forests, the essentials of human life were remarkably similar. Food shared, dangers faced collectively, and meaning sought through ritual and memory. The first part of civilization's tale is not measured in monuments or empires, but in the slow accumulation of habits and ideas that made later achievements possible. By the end of this vast age, humanity had spread to nearly every corner of the earth, carrying with it tools of stone, languages of countless forms, and traditions as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. They were still wanderers, still bound to the hunt and the forage. Yet already they had laid the groundwork for futures they could not yet imagine. From these beginnings, small bands bound by firelight and memory, would one day emerge the settled villages, the ploughed fields, the written records, and the monumental cities. But before such things, there was this, the long dawn when humanity learned to endure, to adapt, and to dream. Some revolutions arrived not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet rhythm of seeds pressing through soil. The Neolithic transformation began in scattered valleys, where human hands, long accustomed to spears and digging sticks, discovered that plants could be tamed, animals could be guided, and the restless wandering of ancestors might give way to rooted lives. It was not a single event, but a gradual shift, unfolding over millennia as people across the world chose, again and again, to stay. In the Fertile Crescent, between the Tigris and Euphrates, wild stands of wheat and barley bent in the wind, their grains gathered by communities who began noticing which seeds grew strongest. Over time, the best harvests were no longer found, but planted. Goats, once hunted across rocky hills, grew accustomed to human presence. Sheep followed, then pigs and cattle, animals gradually reshaped by human selection until they no longer resembled their wild kin. The landscape itself began to change under human will, each season layering new traces of permanence. What began as scattered huts grew into the first settlements. Jericho rose behind mud brick walls, its people farming the land near a spring that had guided countless travelers before them, enduring through centuries. At Çatalhöyük, houses pressed so tightly against one another that inhabitants moved across rooftops rather than streets, their lives intertwined in ways unknown to nomadic bands. These villages were not merely shelters. They were statements declaring that human beings could claim a place and transform it into something enduring. The new way of life came with profound consequences. Grain stored in clay jars promised survival during lean months, but storage also drew pests and disease. Living close to animals meant exposure to new illnesses, smallpox, measles, influenza, that would become devastating weapons millennia later when societies separated by oceans first encountered each other. Yet the same illnesses slowly forged resilience. Generations exposed to them built immunities that would grant decisive, if tragic, advantages in future encounters. As populations grew, social bonds changed. A small band of 30 could live by memory and mutual trust, but a village of 200 required new structures. Elders or chiefs arose to arbitrate disputes. Rituals expanded into communal ceremonies designed to bind larger groups together. Shared feasts, burial customs, and shrines created cohesion, where kinship alone could not suffice. Religion itself shifted, often away from spirits of the hunt toward deities linked to fertility, harvest, and the cycle of seasons. The landscape bore marks of these spiritual changes. Megaliths appeared, stone circles aligned with the sun and stars, silent witnesses to rituals that sought to connect earthbound labor with cosmic rhythms. Painted figurines of mother goddesses filled shrines, their broad hips and full breasts embodying hopes for fertility of both soil and family. The divine was no longer distant in the sky alone, but present in the very fields that sustained life. With farming yielding surplus, invention thrived. Clay was molded into vessels, hardened in kilns to guard grain from moisture and pests. Weaving advanced as flax and wool were spun into cloth, allowing clothing to become more than mere protection. It became expression, identity, and status. Stone tools grew sharper, polished to fine edges that cut with precision, and soon communities learned to trade their best products across valleys and rivers. The act of trading itself wove links across distances. Villages produced more than they consumed, exchanging grain for obsidian, wool for shells, salt for flint. These exchanges stitched together distant peoples, carrying not only goods, but also ideas. A style of pottery might travel hundreds of miles, an agricultural technique even farther. Knowledge no longer depended solely on kinship networks. It spread through webs of trade that prefigured the great commercial routes of later ages. While many welcomed stability, farming was not without hardship. Fields demanded constant attention: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. Hunter-gatherers had known times of scarcity, but they also knew seasons of plenty and leisure. Farmers, by contrast, lived according to a strict calendar, bound to the cycle of crops. Malnutrition even increased in some early communities as diets narrowed to grain-heavy meals, leaving bones fragile and bodies stunted. Yet the long-term promise of security outweighed these immediate drawbacks, and the agrarian path became humanity's dominant choice. Permanent homes reshaped family life. In nomadic camps, possessions were few, carried easily on the next march. In villages, possessions accumulated: grinding stones, loom weights, storage jars, plows. Property took on meaning, and with it came inheritance, wealth, and inequality. Some families accumulated more livestock or larger plots, passing them to children who would begin life with advantage. Hierarchies hardened, and human society, once relatively fluid, grew more stratified. The walls of Jericho rose not only for defense, but as symbols of community pride. Organized labor was needed to raise towers, dig ditches, and maintain irrigation. Such projects demanded coordination, compelling the emergence of leaders with authority that stretched beyond the family hearth. These leaders often cloaked power in ritual, presenting themselves as mediators between humans and gods. The seed of kingship lay here, though it would take centuries to sprout into full monarchies. Faith itself adapted to the new reality of fixed communities. Shrines at Göbekli Tepe, older even than agriculture in some cases, suggested that sacred centers may have inspired settled life, rather than simply resulting from it. Stone pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols reveal communities willing to gather and build before they had even mastered farming. This interplay between belief and sustenance shaped the spiritual imagination of humanity, ensuring that villages were not only centers of production, but also of meaning. In distant lands, parallel revolutions unfolded. In the valleys of the Yellow River, millet farming took root, while rice cultivation thrived in the wetlands of the Yangtze. Across the Americas, maize, beans, and squash formed the three sisters that nourished civilizations to come. In New Guinea, taro and yams sustained mountain communities, while in Africa, sorghum and millet adapted to the rhythms of savanna and desert. Each region shaped agriculture to its environment, proving that humanity's transformation was not confined to a single cradle, but emerged wherever people sought permanence. As crops spread, so too did animals. Dogs had long accompanied hunters, but now they herded flocks and guarded homes. Cattle, domesticated on the steppes, provided not only meat but also muscle to pull plows. Their strength turned soil more deeply than human hands could manage, increasing yields and enabling larger settlements. Horses, first used for meat and later for transport, expanded human mobility and power. Though their greatest impact lay centuries in the future, communities multiplied, pressing against one another's boundaries. Conflicts over land and water grew sharper, for fields could not be abandoned lightly. Warfare changed character, no longer raids for plunder alone, but struggles for territory that sustained entire generations. Wooden palisades and ditches encircled villages, their construction proclaiming both vulnerability and determination. Victory in battle now meant not just spoils, but survival for one's children. Still, cooperation often triumphed over violence. Villages banded together into networks, pooling resources during lean years, sharing labor on large projects, and celebrating festivals that reaffirmed bonds. These networks laid the groundwork for future states, showing that complexity did not emerge solely from coercion, but also from shared interest. The Neolithic Revolution left an indelible mark upon the earth. Forests were cleared to make way for fields, rivers diverted into irrigation canals, landscapes reshaped in ways that would echo for millennia. Humanity was no longer simply adapting to the world. It was remaking it. The scars of this remaking remain visible today in terraces, ancient field systems, and the pollen records of long-vanished forests. By the close of this epoch, humanity had undergone one of its greatest transformations. Once bound to the uncertain fortunes of the hunt, people now tied their lives to soil and seasons. The rhythm of sowing and harvest, of birth and death of flocks, set the pace of human existence. With these changes came stability, but also new dangers: disease, inequality, conflict, and environmental strain. Yet the rewards proved irresistible. The age of villages, surplus, and specialization had begun. From the surplus grain came artisans, priests, and leaders who no longer needed to toil in the fields. From settlements came monuments, rituals, and law. And from the tethering of humanity to land came the first foundations of what we call civilization. In the lands of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates spilled their waters into floodplains of deep silt, a new chapter in human history took form. Here, the world's first cities rose from mud and brick, transforming scattered villages into urban centers whose scale had never been seen before. The shift was monumental, not only in architecture, but in the very imagination of what human community could become. The rivers brought both promise and peril. Each year their floods deposited fertile soil, making harvests possible even under scorching suns. Yet the same floods could arrive with destructive force, sweeping away fields and homes in a single season. To survive, communities built irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs. These systems demanded planning, labor, and above all, coordination. No single family could control a river. It required collective effort, and soon enough, central authority. Out of the mud of irrigation, ditches emerged not only crops, but the first forms of organized government. Villages that once clustered around shrines grew into city-states, each with its patron deity and priestly class. Uruk, among the earliest and greatest, stretched across hundreds of acres, its population perhaps surpassing 10,000, an unimaginable scale compared to Neolithic hamlets. Within its walls rose the ziggurat, a stepped temple reaching toward the sky, where priests mediated between humans and gods. These monumental structures proclaimed both spiritual devotion and earthly power, announcing that here was a place unlike any before. Life inside these early cities was a whirlwind of activity. Farmers still worked fields beyond the walls, but within them thrived new specialists. Potters turned wheels to shape uniform vessels. Metalworkers hammered copper into tools and ornaments. Weavers produced textiles that traveled along trade routes reaching distant lands. Surplus grain stored in great granaries sustained not only farmers, but also the growing classes of priests, artisans, and rulers who depended on agricultural abundance for their authority. Authority itself found new expressions. Kingship emerged, first as leadership in times of war, and later as permanent office sanctified by divine favor. The ruler was not merely a military commander, but the custodian of canals, temples, and law. His palace rose alongside the ziggurat, secular and sacred power intertwined. From these halls radiated commands that could mobilize thousands for construction or battle, commands enforced by soldiers loyal not to clan but to city. With surplus and complexity came a need for record-keeping. Grain owed to temples, livestock delivered for sacrifice, workers assigned to projects, all demanded accurate accounts. Out of this necessity was born writing. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks recorded transactions long before they told myths or history. Cuneiform began as lists and numbers, bookkeeping etched in damp clay, dried in the sun. Literature would follow, but the first marks were practical, reflecting the economic foundations of urban life. The invention was revolutionary. Once knowledge could be fixed in clay, it could be transmitted across generations without reliance on memory alone. Contracts, treaties, inventories, and eventually stories could endure beyond the lifespan of those who composed them. Writing was at first a tool of temples and palaces, instruments of authority and commerce, but it became the seed of all later literature. Amid this ferment, stories emerged that gave shape to human longing and fear. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's earliest surviving epic, told of a king who sought immortality but found only the inevitability of death. In its verses resounded the anxieties of an urban people, aware that their cities might endure yet conscious of the fragility of human life. Through such tales, city dwellers sought meaning in a world now too vast for every face to be familiar, too complex for tradition alone to sustain. Trade flourished as cities connected to distant lands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, tin from Anatolia, all flowed into Mesopotamian markets. Merchants carried not only goods, but also ideas, spreading innovations across mountains and seas. Cultural contact accelerated in ways impossible during the Neolithic. No city could remain wholly isolated. Prosperity demanded exchange, but expansion was not without strain. Towns of 10 or 20,000 pressed beyond the limits of simple food abundance. They required rules, order, and enforcement. Law codes began to appear, some preserved in fragments centuries before Hammurabi's famous stele. Justice shifted from kin-based vengeance to regulated penalties overseen by rulers. Compensation, punishment, and contracts took form under written authority, binding communities together under law rather than custom alone. Inequality grew sharper in these settings. Elite families controlled temples, palaces, and large tracts of land, while common laborers toiled in fields and workshops. Slavery became a fixture, whether through war, debt, or birth. Yet alongside hierarchy flourished artistry and culture. Cylinder seals carved with exquisite precision left impressions on clay tablets, combining function with beauty. Music echoed in temple courts, harps and lyres accompanying hymns to gods who ruled both heaven and the affairs of men. The sacred was woven into urban existence. Every city stood under the protection of a patron god. Inanna for Uruk, Enlil for Nippur, Anu reigning in the sky. Rituals were elaborate, festivals tied to agricultural cycles, sacrifices meant to secure divine favor. The gods mirrored the structure of human society, each with domains, rivalries, and hierarchies. To offend them was to risk famine or flood. To honor them was to secure prosperity. Kingship was bound to the sacred. Rulers were shown as chosen by the gods, and at times portrayed as gods in their own right. Such claims were reinforced through architecture, art, and ceremony. The king's role as protector of irrigation canals, organizer of defense, and mediator of disputes was wrapped in sacred aura. Political authority and spiritual devotion reinforced one another in ways that would echo through millennia of governance. Despite their achievements, early cities faced vulnerabilities. Drought could cripple harvests, and when irrigation systems failed, populations suffered. Rival city-states waged war for control of water and land, building walls and battering rams in cycles of conflict that marked Mesopotamian history from the beginning. Urban splendor always balanced on fragile foundations, on rivers that could betray, on alliances that could crumble, on resources that could be exhausted. Even so, from these precarious beginnings, civilization, as we recognize it, took shape. The city became humanity's new home, a place where thousands of strangers could coexist, bound not by kin, but by shared systems of law, economy, and belief. Writing ensured continuity. Temples gave spiritual unity. Kings commanded labor on a scale unimaginable to earlier generations. When viewed from a distance, the rise of sumo was not inevitable. It was an experiment, fraught with risk, but it proved enduring. The idea of the city, once born, would never vanish. From Mesopotamia, it spread outward, carried into Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and beyond. Humanity had entered a new age, where memory was written in clay, power was measured in walls and granaries, and the destiny of millions would forever after be tied to the fortunes of cities. In the lands of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates spilled their waters into floodplains of deep silt, a new chapter in human history took form. Here, the world's first cities rose from mud and brick, transforming scattered villages into urban centers whose scale had never been seen before. The shift was monumental, not only in architecture, but in the very imagination of what human community could become. The rivers brought both promise and peril. Each year their floods deposited fertile soil, making harvests possible even under scorching suns. Yet the same floods could arrive with destructive force, sweeping away fields and homes in a single season. To survive, communities built irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs. These systems demanded planning, labor, and above all, coordination. No single family could control a river. It required collective effort, and soon enough, central authority. Out of the mud of irrigation, ditches emerged not only crops, but the first forms of organized government. Villages that once clustered around shrines grew into city-states, each with its patron deity and priestly class. Uruk, among the earliest and greatest, stretched across hundreds of acres, its population perhaps surpassing 10,000, an unimaginable scale compared to Neolithic hamlets. Within its walls rose the ziggurat, a stepped temple reaching toward the sky, where priests mediated between humans and gods. These monumental structures proclaimed both spiritual devotion and earthly power, announcing that here was a place unlike any before. Life inside these early cities was a whirlwind of activity. Farmers still worked fields beyond the walls, but within them thrived new specialists. Potters turned wheels to shape uniform vessels. Metalworkers hammered copper into tools and ornaments. Weavers produced textiles that traveled along trade routes reaching distant lands. Surplus grain stored in great granaries sustained not only farmers, but also the growing classes of priests, artisans, and rulers who depended on agricultural abundance for their authority. Authority itself found new expressions. Kingship emerged, first as leadership in times of war, and later as permanent office sanctified by divine favor. The ruler was not merely a military commander, but the custodian of canals, temples, and law. His palace rose alongside the ziggurat, secular and sacred power intertwined. From these halls radiated commands that could mobilize thousands for construction or battle, commands enforced by soldiers loyal not to clan but to city. With surplus and complexity came a need for record keeping. Grain owed to temples, livestock delivered for sacrifice, workers assigned to projects, all demanded accurate accounts. Out of this necessity was born writing. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks recorded transactions long before they told myths or history. Cuneiform began as lists and numbers, bookkeeping etched in damp clay, dried in the sun. Literature would follow, but the first marks were practical, reflecting the economic foundations of urban life. The invention was revolutionary. Once knowledge could be fixed in clay, it could be transmitted across generations without reliance on memory alone. Contracts, treaties, inventories, and eventually stories could endure beyond the lifespan of those who composed them. Writing was at first a tool of temples and palaces, instruments of authority and commerce, but it became the seed of all later literature. Amid this ferment, stories emerged that gave shape to human longing and fear. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's earliest surviving epic, told of a king who sought immortality but found only the inevitability of death. In its verses resounded the anxieties of an urban people, aware that their cities might endure yet conscious of the fragility of human life. Through such tales, city dwellers sought meaning in a world now too vast for every face to be familiar, too complex for tradition alone to sustain. Trade flourished as cities connected to distant lands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, tin from Anatolia, all flowed into Mesopotamian markets. Merchants carried not only goods, but also ideas, spreading innovations across mountains and seas. Cultural contact accelerated in ways impossible during the Neolithic. No city could remain wholly isolated. Prosperity demanded exchange, but expansion was not without strain. Towns of 10 or 20,000 pressed beyond the limits of simple food abundance. They required rules, order, and enforcement. Law codes began to appear, some preserved in fragments centuries before Hammurabi's famous stele. Justice shifted from kin-based vengeance to regulated penalties overseen by rulers. Compensation, punishment, and contracts took form under written authority, binding communities together under law rather than custom alone. Inequality grew sharper in these settings. Elite families controlled temples, palaces, and large tracts of land, while common laborers toiled in fields and workshops. Slavery became a fixture, whether through war, debt, or birth. Yet alongside hierarchy flourished artistry and culture. Cylinder seals carved with exquisite precision left impressions on clay tablets, combining function with beauty. Music echoed in temple courts, harps and lyres accompanying hymns to gods who ruled both heaven and the affairs of men. The sacred was woven into urban existence. Every city stood under the protection of a patron god. Inanna for Uruk, Enlil for Nippur, Anu reigning in the sky. Rituals were elaborate, festivals tied to agricultural cycles, sacrifices meant to secure divine favor. The gods mirrored the structure of human society, each with domains, rivalries, and hierarchies. To offend them was to risk famine or flood. To honor them was to secure prosperity. Kingship was bound to the sacred. Rulers were shown as chosen by the gods, and at times portrayed as gods in their own right. Such claims were reinforced through architecture, art, and ceremony. The king's role as protector of irrigation canals, organizer of defense, and mediator of disputes was wrapped in sacred aura. Political authority and spiritual devotion reinforced one another in ways that would echo through millennia of governance. Despite their achievements, early cities faced vulnerabilities. Drought could cripple harvests, and when irrigation systems failed, populations suffered. Rival city-states waged war for control of water and land, building walls and battering rams in cycles of conflict that marked Mesopotamian history from the beginning. Urban splendor always balanced on fragile foundations, on rivers that could betray, on alliances that could crumble, on resources that could be exhausted. Even so, from these precarious beginnings, civilization, as we recognize it, took shape. The city became humanity's new home, a place where thousands of strangers could coexist, bound not by kin, but by shared systems of law, economy, and belief. Writing ensured continuity. Temples gave spiritual unity. Kings commanded labor on a scale unimaginable to earlier generations. When viewed from a distance, the rise of sumo was not inevitable. It was an experiment, fraught with risk, but it proved enduring. The idea of the city, once born, would never vanish. From Mesopotamia, it spread outward, carried into Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and beyond. Humanity had entered a new age, where memory was written in clay, power was measured in walls and granaries, and the destiny of millions would forever after be tied to the fortunes of cities. When the dust of Mesopotamia swirled in the hot winds, armies gathered under banners never before seen. Out of scattered city-states rose the first empires, realms bound not only by walls and gods, but by conquest that stretched across entire landscapes. The Bronze Age had matured, and with it came new visions of power, forged in copper and tin, carried in the wheels of chariots, and sealed by the ambitions of kings who dreamed of ruling more than a single city. Sargon of Akkad was among the first to grasp what this age could yield. Born, so legend claimed, in secret, and placed in a basket upon the river, he rose from obscurity to carve a realm that bound Sumerian cities under one crown. His soldiers marched not only for plunder, but for permanence, their victories stitched together into a network of governors, garrisons, and tribute. In Akkad's palaces, scribes pressed cuneiform into clay, recording shipments of grain and lists of provinces, evidence that the dream of empire had taken flesh. His legacy lived on long after his death. Daughters and grandsons struggled to hold the empire together, but drought and invasion pressed hard upon their borders. Still, the memory of Sargon lingered like a shadow over every ruler who followed. He had shown that it was possible to rule not a city, but a world, however fragile that world might be. From the ruins of Akkad, new powers rose. Babylon grew from riverbanks into a metropolis whose name would echo through millennia. Hammurabi, its most famous king, ordered the laws of his realm carved into stone for all to see. In markets and temples, people gathered to hear these words read aloud. Penalties for theft, rules for marriage, obligations between debtor and lender. Justice, once the province of custom and clan, now bore the seal of royal authority. Hammurabi presented himself not merely as king, but as shepherd of his people, his laws the staff with which he guided them. Beyond Mesopotamia, new powers tested the limits of bronze. The Hittites of Anatolia harnessed the chariot, turning battlefields into thunderous contests of speed and shock. 2 horses pulled wooden frames lined with warriors, their bronze-tipped spears flashing in the sun. Against infantry, such machines were terrifying, cutting through ranks that had never faced such fury. In their mountain strongholds, the Hittites forged treaties on clay tablets, sometimes allies with Egypt, sometimes enemies, but always a presence to be reckoned with. Farther west, on the islands and peninsulas of the Aegean, other cultures flourished. Crete's Minoans built palaces at Knossos, where frescoes of dolphins and dancers adorned walls that concealed storerooms filled with oil and grain. Their ships, sleek and swift, ruled the seas, carrying goods and stories from one harbor to another. To the north, the Mycenaeans built citadels of stone so massive that later Greeks believed giants had placed them. Kings ruled from megarons, decorated with bright paint, their wealth buried in shaft graves filled with gold masks and jeweled daggers. Trade bound these worlds together. Tin from distant mountains mixed with copper to make bronze, and without it, weapons dulled, tools weakened. Caravans carried ingots across deserts, ships ferried them across seas. Along these routes, ideas and gods traveled as surely as metals. Stories of storms and war deities echoed from Mesopotamia to the Aegean, reshaped with each retelling, binding distant peoples in shared imagination, even as they remained strangers. Still, this brilliance carried within it seeds of collapse. The 13th century before Christ brought with it droughts that shriveled crops and emptied granaries. Across the eastern Mediterranean, records of desperate letters survive. Kings begging allies for shipments of grain, priests lamenting offerings too meager to appease the gods. Famine gnawed at the edges of empires that had seemed invincible. Into this weakened world came waves of wanderers. Ancient inscriptions speak of the sea peoples, raiders whose ships appeared like storms upon the horizon. They struck at Hittite ports, ravaged coastal cities, and even dared to challenge Egypt itself. Ramses III recorded their defeat in battle, but his triumph was costly, his kingdom forever strained by the effort. Other realms were less fortunate. The palaces of Mycenaean kings burned. Hittite archives fell silent. Across wide stretches of the Mediterranean, the lights of Bronze Age splendor flickered and went dark. Layers of ash and deserted homes tell of cities left behind, not by choice, but by disaster. Whether driven by hunger, invasion, or internal revolt, the result was the same. A cascade of failures that toppled kingdoms in rapid succession. Trade routes vanished, and with them the supply of tin that fed bronze forges. Craftsmen laid down their tools. Scribes ceased their records. For generations, much of the world regressed into smaller communities, living among the ruins of their ancestors' grandeur. Even so, collapse was never absolute. In Egypt, pharaohs clung to power, though their reach shrank. In Mesopotamia, city-states endured even as empires crumbled. From the ashes of Mycenae, Greek bards preserved memory and song, passing down tales that would one day shape Homer's epics. Even in failure, the Bronze Age left seeds for rebirth. When ice cores today reveal signs of ancient drought, they confirm what inscriptions and ruins already suggest. Nature itself played a role in the unraveling. The delicate balance between human ambition and environmental constraint tipped too far. Once fields failed, armies starved. Once caravans faltered, cities emptied. It was a lesson carved into stone and soil alike, that even the mightiest empire remains at the mercy of the earth. Still, the memory of this age never vanished. Later civilizations would look back to Sargon, to Hammurabi, to the builders of Knossos and Mycenae, seeing in them the first glimmers of empire, law, and artistry. The Bronze Age, though it ended in fire and silence, had shown humanity what was possible when organization, innovation, and imagination were bound together. Its fall, just as vividly, showed the cost of overreaching a fragile world. The story of civilization now stood at a threshold. Out of collapse would come reinvention, carried on a new metal that required no distant tin, only the iron beneath every hill. In the centuries that followed, iron blades would cut fields and enemies alike, and new kingdoms would rise to claim what the Bronze Age had left behind. In the smoking pits of forgotten forges, a new metal began to sing. Iron, darker and harder than bronze, emerged first as a curiosity and soon as a revolution. Unlike tin, which required distant trade, iron could be smelted from ores found in many lands. At first, its brittle forms disappointed smiths, but with skill and heat, it yielded blades that cut deeper, plows that turned more soil, and weapons that reshaped the balance of power. The monopoly of bronze crumbled, and with it, the aristocracies who had once guarded their hoarded metals like sacred fire. Across the Near East, empires rose again from the wreckage of the Bronze Age. In Assyria, kings with names that still resound, Ashur-nasir-pal, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, gathered armies unlike any the world had known. They marched with iron swords and spears, their ranks disciplined and relentless. Siege engines rolled against the walls of rebellious cities, while battering rams smashed gates once thought impregnable. In the palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, sculpted reliefs show lines of captives trudging before the king, tribute carried on their backs, fear carved into their faces. Assyrian rulers claimed more than military might. They styled themselves guardians of order, chosen by the gods to impose peace through terror. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled, their loyalty broken and their memories scattered. By scattering peoples across their empire, the kings created a mosaic difficult to unite in rebellion. Yet beneath this cruelty lay an efficiency that kept the Assyrian realm alive for centuries. Even so, power remained precarious. When Babylonia reawakened under Nebuchadnezzar II, its grandeur rivaled any kingdom of the age. Babylon's walls rose massive and gleaming, the Ishtar Gate dazzling with blue-glazed bricks and golden lions striding proudly across its surface. Hanging gardens, whether myth or reality, spoke of ambition that reached beyond necessity into legend. Here, kings spoke of themselves not merely as rulers, but as builders of eternity, their monuments rivaling those of Egypt. The period was stamped by belief and by displacement, with consequences that endured. Hebrew prophets, carried into captivity in Babylon, sang laments by the rivers of Mesopotamia. Their words promised hope that exile was not the end, that covenant endured beyond kingdom and temple. Out of defeat grew scriptures that would shape half the world's faith. The same empire that sought to extinguish a people instead preserved their voice in memory. a paradox at the heart of human history. While empires of the rivers battled, a new power emerged farther east. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, forged an empire vast beyond measure. From the mountains of Iran, he swept across Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, down into Egypt. Unlike Assyrian kings who ruled by terror, Cyrus proclaimed tolerance. Conquered peoples could worship their own gods, keep their traditions, and live under local laws, so long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Persian supremacy. This policy bound the realm together, not through fear alone, but through consent, however grudging. Darius the Great expanded this vision. At Persepolis, artisans from across the empire carved stairways lined with dignitaries bearing tribute, Ethiopians with ivory, Indians with spices, Greeks with vessels of silver. The empire became a theatre of diversity, each culture both distinct and bound to the whole. Royal roads stretched from Susa to Sardis, messengers galloping in relays that made it possible for decrees to reach distant satrapies within days. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers, wrote admiring observers, a phrase that would echo long after Persia itself fell. Beyond Persia's heartlands, other peoples made their mark. Phoenician sailors steered their purple-sailed ships across the Mediterranean, founding colonies as far west as Carthage. From their ports, the alphabet spread, simple letters replacing complex scripts of cuneiform and hieroglyph. Traders inscribed cargo lists and contracts with symbols that a child could learn, and in time, Greeks and Romans would adopt and reshape these letters into the alphabets that still write our stories today. In the hills of Canaan, small kingdoms clung to survival amid giants. The Israelites, alternately independent and subjugated, preserved their history in scrolls that mingled law, poetry, and prophecy. To them, empire was not only a matter of armies, but of faith, whether their god had abandoned them or tested them, whether kingship was blessing or curse. These questions, raised in the shadow of greater powers, would echo for millennia, long after Babylon's palaces crumbled. The spread of iron touched more than battlefields. Farmers wielded stronger plows that cut through heavy soils, turning wastelands into fertile fields. Harvests swelled, populations grew, and new towns appeared across landscapes once thinly settled. Iron axes felled forests, opening clearings for farms and ships alike. With every tool, humanity reshaped its environment more aggressively than ever before, harnessing the strength of a metal that seemed inexhaustible. Even as prosperity spread, conflict followed. In Anatolia, the kingdom of Urartu rose and fell beneath Assyrian campaigns. In Greece, scattered city-states began to flourish, their warriors carrying iron-tipped spears into battles that would one day shake Persia itself. In India, the Ganges plain filled with new settlements, iron plows carving out kingdoms where Vedic hymns gave way to cities and monarchs. Each region experienced its own awakening, but all shared in the new material that reshaped life from soil to sword. Assyrian kings, despite their brilliance, could not escape the fate of overreach. Their empire, stretched too wide, collapsed under rebellion and invasion. Babylonia briefly claimed supremacy again, but its splendor was short-lived, consumed at last by Persia's inexorable advance. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he presented himself not as conqueror, but as restorer, returning exiles to their homes, honoring the gods of the land. With that gesture, he proclaimed a different model of rule, one that promised endurance through inclusion rather than domination. Thus, the Iron Age opened not only with sharper blades, but with sharper visions of power. Some rulers relied on fear, others on tolerance. but all recognized that the world had grown larger, more complex, and more interconnected. Roads, alphabets, and empires bound together regions that had once seemed distant, while iron tools and weapons gave ordinary people new strength to labor and to fight. Out of the collapse of the Bronze Age came the renewal of the Iron Age. Out of its crucibles emerged kingdoms that would lay the groundwork for classical antiquity, empires whose influence would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Indus, and ideas of law, faith, and empire that still shape our imaginations. The world had entered a new age of ambition, and it was written not in clay or bronze alone, but in iron. Beneath the bright sun of the Aegean, the land of Greece stretched in broken fragments, mountains that carved valleys apart, coastlines that folded into countless bays, islands strung across the sea like scattered jewels. Out of this fractured landscape emerged a form of life, both fragile and fierce. The polis, the city-state, small enough for every citizen to know his neighbor, yet ambitious enough to challenge empires. Athens rose from the rock of the Acropolis, its temples gleaming white against the sky. Here farmers, merchants, and craftsmen gathered in the agora, the open marketplace where politics, gossip, and philosophy intertwined. Across the peninsula, Sparta trained its children in the arts of war. Boys taken from their families at 7, molded into soldiers who would fight not for gold, but for the honor of their city. Each polis cultivated its own identity, proud, independent, and often quarrelsome, yet bound together by language, religion, and festivals that honored the Olympian gods. War with Persia brought these rival states into uneasy alliance. When Darius the Great demanded submission, envoys carrying earth and water as tokens of surrender, some Greek cities complied. Others, defiant, cast the messengers into pits and wells. At Marathon, a plain north of Athens, a smaller Greek force met the vast Persian army. Shields locked, spears braced, they charged. Against all expectation, the Persians broke. A messenger ran the long miles to Athens to proclaim victory, his exhausted death becoming legend. The victory at Marathon was more than a battle won. It was a declaration that free citizens could stand against the wealth of kings. The struggle deepened a decade later, when Xerxes crossed into Greece with an army so vast it seemed to drink rivers dry. At Thermopylae, King Leonidas and his Spartan warriors made their stand in a narrow pass, holding back wave after wave, until betrayal revealed a hidden path. They died to the last, their sacrifice buying time for the Greek fleet to gather. At Salamis, Athenian ships lured the Persians into narrow waters, where their numbers counted for little. Wooden rams splintered hulls, men leapt into the sea, and the tide of empire receded. In the wake of these victories, Athens grew bold. Under Pericles, its democracy flourished. Citizens gathered on the Nix Hill to vote on war, taxes, and law, each man's voice equal in principle, though in practice limited to free-born males. The city invested in walls, harbours, and fleets, transforming the Delian League from defensive alliance into an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute poured in from allied states, funding not only triremes, but marble temples. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, its columns a hymn in stone to the goddess Athena, and to the city's own self-confidence. Democracy was both daring and precarious. Orators swayed assemblies with their eloquence. Generals rose and fell on the tide of public favor. Decisions were made in open debate, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with recklessness. The same citizens who voted for freedom also voted for war, and the same democracy that built the Parthenon condemned Socrates to death for questioning too boldly. While Athens prided itself on words, Sparta clung to discipline. Its kings and ephors ruled a society built on conquest, where helots, enslaved populations, worked the land so Spartan warriors could devote themselves entirely to arms. Their training was merciless, their loyalty absolute. To outsiders, Spartan life seemed harsh, even brutal. Yet to Spartans themselves, it was a devotion to order, duty, and strength that no luxury could soften. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta, long simmering, erupted in the Peloponnesian War. Decades of fighting ravaged the land. Plague struck Athens, carrying off Pericles himself. Alliances shifted, cities betrayed one another, and Greek against Greek fought until exhaustion. Sparta triumphed in the end, but victory left her drained, and the unity forged against Persia was shattered. Greece had proven its brilliance, but also its fatal disunity. Still, amid the wars, philosophy blossomed. In Athens, Socrates walked barefoot through the agora, questioning citizens with relentless logic. "What is justice?" he asked. "What is virtue?" His inquiries unsettled the complacent, forcing men to confront their ignorance. His disciple Plato built dialogues that envisioned ideal republics, worlds where philosophers ruled and truth was sought above all else. Aristotle, in turn, catalogued the natural world, from the stars in the heavens to the creatures in the sea, seeking order in the diversity of creation. Drama, too, flourished. In the theatres carved into hillsides, thousands gathered to watch tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, where kings grappled with fate and gods with human folly. Comedy laughed at politicians and generals, proving that in Athens even laughter could be a weapon. These performances were more than entertainment. They were civic rituals, shaping the shared identity of the polis. Beyond Greece, the age was not confined. Across the world, thinkers and teachers arose almost simultaneously. Confucius in China taught of harmony and duty. Buddha in India spoke of suffering and its end. Hebrew prophets called for justice and mercy. Historians later called it the Axial Age, when humanity everywhere seemed to lift its gaze to higher questions of meaning. Greece was one voice in this chorus, but its voice was distinctive, rational, questioning, insistent that humans themselves could seek truth without divine dictation. From the turmoil of the Peloponnesian War, a new figure rose. Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon. Tutored by Aristotle, hardened by campaigns, he swept across Greece and then eastward, defeating Persia and carrying Greek culture to the edge of India. Cities bearing his name sprang up from Egypt to Bactria, their marketplaces filled with Greek sculpture, Persian carpets, and Indian spices. In this fusion, Hellenism was born, a blend of traditions that crossed boundaries once thought unbridgeable. Alexander's death left his empire divided among generals, yet the seed he planted endured. Greek became the language of trade and scholarship across vast regions. Temples mixed deities from different lands. Philosophers debated alongside priests of foreign gods, and sculptors blended styles into forms never before imagined. What had begun in the small polis now stretched across continents. With triumphs and with tragedies, the Greek experiment left its mark. From the city-states sprang democracy, philosophy, drama, and art, ideas and forms that future civilizations would inherit and renew. Though the polis itself would fade, its spirit remained, whispering that even the smallest community, if bold enough, could influence the destiny of the world. On the banks of the Tiber, shepherds once watched flocks graze near 7 low hills. Out of this modest beginning rose a settlement that would one day claim to rule seas and continents. Its story was framed in legend, twins abandoned, a wolf nursing infants, a quarrel ending in blood. The tale of Romulus and Remus may be myth, yet it captured the truth that violence and ambition lay at the heart of the city's foundation. At first, kings held sway. They built temples, dug sewers, and led armies. Yet memory hardened against monarchy. Noble families, proud of their ancestors, claimed they would never again bow to a crown. They created instead a republic, two consuls sharing authority, a senate guiding policy, assemblies where citizens raised voices in approval or dissent. Power was divided so no man could claim too much. It was a fragile experiment, but one that endured for centuries. Citizens came to see service to the state as the highest duty. Farmers laid aside plows when danger threatened, marching out as soldiers before returning to tend their fields. In the forum, orators thundered, their words echoing off marble walls, while magistrates inscribed decisions into wax and bronze. Life in this community was not merely private, it was public, tied to laws and rituals that bound neighbors together. The Mediterranean tested this order. Carthage, wealthy and ancient, ruled trade across the Western Sea. Its ships filled harbors with cedar and silver. Its generals commanded mercenaries from half the known world. Conflict was inevitable. The Punic Wars raged for generations, pitting the endurance of Italian farmers against the wealth of Africa's great port. Hannibal, boldest of Carthaginian commanders, marched elephants across the Alps. His victories shook Italy, yet the city endured, raising fresh legions year after year. The struggle ended in ashes. Carthage fell, its walls torn down, its survivors sold into slavery. Fields were ploughed with salt as a warning to any who might challenge the power on the Tiber. With that victory, the Republic became master of the Western Mediterranean. Ships bearing grain, gold, and slaves poured into its harbors. Triumphs filled the streets with spectacle. Generals riding in chariots crowned with laurel. Foreign kings trudging behind in chains. Conquest enriched the few while straining the many. Senators and nobles grew wealthy, buying vast estates worked by slaves. Small farmers, unable to compete, abandoned their plots and crowded into the city. Wooden tenements rose skyward, filled with families who depended on state grain to survive. In narrow alleys, discontent simmered, while in the Senate House, ambitious men plotted paths to greater power. The Republic wavered. Armies, once temporary levies, became professional, bound to commanders who promised spoils and land. Gaius Marius opened the legions to the poor, a reform that gave them purpose, but also tied their loyalty to generals rather than the Senate. Soon, Sulla marched on the capital itself, proving that military force could overturn civic order. Blood filled the streets, and ancient traditions bent under the weight of ambition. Amid the chaos rose Julius Caesar. Brilliant in battle, he subdued Gaul, writing of his victories in prose so sharp it carried his fame across the sea. His legions adored him, his enemies feared him, and when ordered to relinquish command, he chose defiance. Crossing the Rubicon with his troops, he declared war on the old order. Civil war followed. Battles flared from Spain to Egypt until Caesar emerged supreme. As ruler, he enacted reforms, easing debt, sending colonists to new lands, reshaping the calendar itself. Yet suspicion lingered. Whispers of kingship haunted him. Senators, sworn to defend liberty, struck on the Ides of March. Daggers flashed, and the man who had reshaped the Republic fell in a pool of blood beneath Pompey's statue. His assassins cried freedom, but the cry rang hollow. Civil war returned, fiercer than before. Into this storm stepped Octavian, Caesar's heir. Patient and calculating, He defeated rivals in battles at Philippi and Actium, leaving Antony and Cleopatra dead and their followers scattered. In the aftermath, he offered peace, cloaking power in old forms. He took the title Princeps, first citizen rather than king, preserving the shell of the republic while holding absolute authority. With Augustus began the empire in all but name. Under his rule, stability returned. Veterans received land, trade flourished, and monuments rose. Marble replaced brick. Roads stretched outward in straight lines, carrying armies and merchants to distant provinces. Along those roads, milestones mark distance, reminding travelers that all journeys led back to the capital. Couriers rode swiftly, bearing orders sealed with imperial authority, their speed so legendary that poets declared neither storm nor darkness could delay them. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, transformed the Mediterranean into a single sphere. In the provinces, governors enforced law, but local elites retained influence, blending native traditions with Roman practice. A Spaniard could rise to high office, a Greek could lecture in the capital, a Syrian could command legions. Citizenship spread outward, binding diverse peoples into one political body. Architecture proclaimed glory. Aqueducts marched across valleys, bringing water to baths and fountains. The Colosseum, vast as a mountain of stone, echoed with cheers as gladiators fought beneath a canvas sky. In forums, bronze statues honored emperors, while laws inscribed in stone spoke of justice. Concrete, stronger than any material before, allowed domes and arches to span spaces that awed all who entered. Beneath grandeur, however, strains persisted. Rebellions flared in Judea, Gaul, and Britain. Ambitious generals dreamed of the throne, their legions ready to march. In times of peace, emperors became patrons of art, law, and learning. In times of weakness, they fell to plots and assassins. Power lay not in Senate decrees, but in the will of armies and the charisma of leaders. From a cluster of huts, the community on the Tiber had become mistress of the Mediterranean. Its legacy was contradictory. Freedom proclaimed, yet many enslaved. Peace celebrated, yet won through conquest. Equality lauded, yet reserved for the privileged. Still, its laws, roads, and monuments endured, shaping civilizations that would follow long after emperors' names faded into dust. The Republic had fallen, the Empire had risen, and with it, the ancient world entered a new age. In the centuries, when iron tools cut deep into fields and empires stretched across continents, something quieter unfolded in hearts and minds. A wave of spiritual searching swept across distant lands almost at once, as if humanity itself paused to ask what lay beyond conquest and wealth. This age of prophets and sages, later called the Axial Age, birthed religions and philosophies that would outlast palaces and armies. On the dusty roads of northern India, a prince once sheltered from hardship encountered sickness, old age, and death. Siddhartha Gautama left his palace behind, wandering among ascetics, fasting until his body weakened, meditating beneath trees until his mind broke through illusion. Beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, he awakened as the Buddha, the Enlightened One. His teaching was not of gods demanding sacrifice, but of suffering, its cause, and the path to its end. Disciples followed him from village to village, carrying bowls for alms, their saffron robes a sign of renunciation. Across the Ganges plain, his words spread. Life is fleeting, desire brings pain, compassion leads to liberation. Monasteries rose beside rivers, echoing with chants, their walls painted with stories of his former lives. Traders carried these teachings along caravan routes, so that before long, merchants in Central Asia, kings in Sri Lanka, and pilgrims in China repeated the Four Noble Truths. The Dharma traveled farther than any army, a conquest of hearts rather than swords. In China, turmoil also bred reflection. The Zhou dynasty, once strong, faltered, and rival states clashed in endless war. Amid the chaos walked a man named Kongfuzi, whom the West would call Confucius. He did not seek visions beneath trees, but order in human conduct. Harmony, he said, came when rulers acted with virtue and subjects with loyalty, when sons honored fathers and brothers treated each other with respect. He taught that government should be moral, not merely powerful, and that learning was a duty of the noble. His disciples recorded his sayings, the Analects, which would guide China for millennia. Even as dynasties fell and kingdoms rose, scholars memorized his words, reciting them in schools and testing them in imperial examinations. His vision did not erase conflict, but it gave structure to a fractured world, insisting that even in war-torn times, dignity and ritual could sustain civilization. Not far away, another voice urged a different path. Laozi, sage of the Tao, spoke of harmony with nature, of yielding rather than striving. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, he said. In mountains and hermitages, seekers practiced meditation, breathing, and stillness, searching not for power or law, but for flow and balance. Where Confucius envisioned society ordered by duty, Taoists dreamed of retreat and simplicity, their philosophy a counterpoint that would shape Chinese art, medicine, and spirituality for centuries. Meanwhile, in the rugged hills of Judah, prophets thundered against injustice. They declared that a single God ruled heaven and earth, not a pantheon of local deities. Amos cried that worship without righteousness was empty. Isaiah promised that nations would beat swords into plowshares. Jeremiah lamented exile, yet insisted covenant still bound people to their God. These voices, rising in synagogues and marketplaces, preserved identity when empires tried to erase it. The people of Israel, scattered and oppressed, clung to texts that outlived Babylonian captivity and Persian dominion. Their scriptures carried the hope of redemption, a faith that suffering was not the end. On the rugged hills of Greece, another search unfolded, not for gods alone, but for reason. Socrates asked questions in the marketplace until young men doubted everything they thought they knew. Plato imagined worlds of ideal forms, unseen yet more real than shadows. Aristotle catalogued plants and stars, searching for order in the variety of existence. These thinkers did not abolish the old gods, yet they opened paths where reason itself could be divine. Their schools became training grounds for minds that sought explanation beyond myth. Even in Persia, spiritual fire burned. Zoroaster proclaimed that the world was a battlefield between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, Ahura Mazda and the lie. His vision of judgment after death, of paradise and punishment, influenced Jews in exile and, through them, Christians and Muslims yet to come. In his hymns, the Gathas echoed the certainty that human choices mattered in a cosmic struggle. Across India, other traditions coalesced. Ancient hymns of the Vedas grew into the great epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana. These stories carried not only battles of heroes, but moral lessons of duty, devotion, and cosmic order. Hinduism, shaped by centuries of ritual, myth, and philosophy, became not one faith but a vast tapestry. Gods like Vishnu, Shiva, and Devi embodied different aspects of the divine, worshipped in temples where bells rang, incense curled, and pilgrims sought blessing. From one end of Eurasia to another, new questions arose. What is justice? What is truth? Why is there suffering? How should rulers govern? These were not the concerns of kings alone, but of sages, monks, and prophets who spoke to farmers and merchants as much as to nobles. The search was universal, even if the answers diverged. Caravans carried more than spices and silk. They carried stories. Along the Silk Roads, merchants debated philosophy in caravanserais. Monks shared sutras, and Jews in exile found Persian neighbors who spoke of fire and angels. The world's spiritual map began to weave together, not into one faith, but into a shared atmosphere of questioning. By the time Rome's legions marched eastward and Han emperors ruled China, the foundations of most great world religions had already been laid. From the Ganges to the Yellow River, from Jerusalem to Athens, voices of the axial age still echoed. Temples rose, scrolls multiplied, disciples traveled, and the questions they asked continued to shape human destiny. No armies marched for the age of prophets and sages. No towering walls defended it. No pyramids of stone proclaimed its power. Still, its legacy endured beyond them all. Empires may collapse, but ideas endure. And in this age, humanity found its deepest revolutions in faith, in wisdom, and in the search for truth. When flames licked the sky above the city once called eternal, men whispered that the world itself was ending. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Visigoths breached the gates of the imperial capital. For the first time in 8 centuries, Rome had fallen to foreign arms. Survivors staggered through smoke and rubble, clutching what few possessions they could carry, while bishops tried to console them that stone walls might crumble, but faith endured. The collapse of empires was no longer unthinkable. It was reality. Beyond the ruined heart of the West, new powers formed out of fragments. Vandals sailed to Africa, seizing Carthage. Visigoths carved kingdoms in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Angles and Saxons in Britain. None of these new realms could match the engineering, bureaucracy, or armies of the old empire. Yet in churches and monasteries, voices of continuity whispered. Monks copied books letter by letter, preserving scriptures, poetry, and philosophy that might otherwise have perished in fire. Cloisters became fortresses of memory, where Latin survived even as marble monuments fell into ruin. To the east, however, the old empire endured. Constantinople rose where Europe met Asia, its walls bristling with towers, its harbors filled with sails. Here, emperors still called themselves Roman, even as Latin faded into Greek. Justinian sat on his throne in the 6th century with visions of reconquest. His generals marched into Italy and North Africa, reclaiming territory once lost. In the capital, the great dome of Hagia Sophia soared heavenward, filled with mosaics that shimmered in lamplight like a glimpse of paradise. Yet plague swept through his empire, cutting down millions, and wars drained resources. Even Byzantium, though more resilient than its western twin, learned how fragile grandeur could be. Amid these upheavals, a new voice sounded from the deserts of Arabia. In Mecca, Muhammad received revelations that proclaimed the oneness of God and called for submission to his will. His words, recited and memorized, became the Quran. Within a generation, Arab tribes united under faith swept outward in astonishing conquests. Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and eventually Persia itself fell beneath banners marked with verses from their new scripture. To followers, it was not conquest, but liberation, an expansion of the House of Islam. These conquests carried more than swords. Scholars in Baghdad translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, at a time when such works risked vanishing elsewhere. Paper, carried from China, multiplied manuscripts. libraries filled with philosophy and science as well as scripture. In the House of Wisdom, knowledge from India, Persia, and Greece converged, creating a synthesis that would later return to Europe as a gift from the very civilization it once considered foreign. In the West, Christianity became the anchor of shattered societies. Missionaries crossed forests and rivers to reach distant tribes. Irish monks sailed stormy seas, carrying gospels bound in intricate designs. In Kent, Augustine knelt before King Ethelbert, preaching the message of salvation. Wooden halls soon gave way to stone churches, and sacred groves became consecrated ground. Conversion did not erase old traditions overnight. Feasts and festivals often survived under new names. Yet slowly, crosses replaced idols, and bishops replaced tribal priests. Kings discovered that faith could be a tool as well as devotion. By kneeling before bishops, they clothed their rule in divine sanction. Oaths sworn on relics carried weight no earthly contract could match. Law codes began to echo scripture, mixing custom with commandments. Even illiterate rulers recognized the power of written words when monks and priests recorded charters and treaties in Latin, language of both church and law. The church also offered sanctuary in an age of violence. Villagers fled to monasteries when raiders came, knowing holy ground might dissuade pillage. Monks prayed for protection, rang bells that marked the hours, and tended fields that fed the hungry. In their gardens, herbs provided medicine. In their schools, children learned to read. They became centers of both spiritual and practical life, islands of order in seas of uncertainty. Faith also divided. In the Eastern Empire, theologians debated the nature of Christ, human, divine, or both. Councils convened, creeds were written, and schisms hardened. Icons glowed in candlelight, but disputes over their use led to fierce struggles, even civil war. The unity of the early church fractured, leaving wounds that never fully healed. Meanwhile, Islam expanded into Spain. Its armies halted only at Tours in Gaul, by Charles Martel's Frankish warriors. Yet even in conquest, cultural exchange flourished. In Cordoba, libraries held hundreds of thousands of volumes. Scholars studied medicine, mathematics, and astronomy beneath the light of oil lamps. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers debated in markets and courts, their ideas mingling as freely as the goods in the bazaars. By the early Middle Ages, the old imperial order had given way to a patchwork of kingdoms bound more by faith than by roads or laws. Latin Christendom looked to Rome not as an empire, but as a church. The Pope, seated in St. Peter's, crowned kings and absolved sinners, his authority spiritual yet deeply political. Across the Mediterranean, caliphs ruled cities filled with gardens, fountains, and scholars, convinced they carried forward the mantle of civilization itself. The fall of ancient empires had not ended the story of human greatness. It had shifted its center. No longer measured by legions and aqueducts alone, power now drew strength from scripture, ritual, and belief. Out of ruins, monasteries, mosques, and cathedrals rose. Out of exile and conquest came philosophies and faiths that promised meaning in a world that seemed unstable. The new age belonged not to emperors alone, but to prophets, bishops, caliphs, and monks. Morning mist clung to the towers of stone keeps, rising above villages huddled in their shadows. Across much of Europe, the age of castles had begun. Lords ruled from hilltop fortresses, their banners flying high, while peasants bent over fields below, bound by ties of service and protection. Feudalism was not invented in a single moment. It emerged out of necessity. With kings too weak to guard every valley, power fractured into countless oaths between knight and lord, serf and master. Life in the countryside revolved around the manor. Wooden ploughs drawn by oxen cut into heavy soils, followed by peasants whose harvests fed both their families and their lords' granaries. In exchange for protection, men owed labor, women spun and wove, children carried water and gathered firewood. Bells rang from village churches, marking hours of work and worship alike. Though humble, these rhythms sustained millions, even as nobles dined in halls hung with tapestries and feasted on game, hunted in forests closed to commoners. Beyond Europe's fields, the Abbasid Caliphate reached its golden age. Baghdad, founded on the banks of the Tigris, glittered with domes and gardens. Scholars gathered in its house of wisdom, translating texts from Greece, Persia, and India. Astronomers mapped the heavens with precision. Physicians wrote manuals still consulted centuries later, and mathematicians refined the numbers that merchants would one day carry into Europe. Caravan routes carried silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and gold from Africa. In its markets, goods from 3 continents mingled, and so did ideas. From Viking longships to Muslim caravans, the medieval world became more connected than ever before. Norsemen rowed up rivers of France and Russia, their dragon-prowed ships slipping through fog to raid monasteries or trade silver. Some settled permanently: Normandy in France, Dublin in Ireland, Kiev on the Dnieper, leaving behind not only destruction, but also new towns, intermarriages, and sagas told around firesides. Climate shaped these centuries as well. A period of relative warmth, remembered as the medieval warm period, lengthened growing seasons. Fields once barren produced surplus grain, allowing villages to expand, markets to thrive, and populations to grow. Cathedrals began to rise above towns, their stone vaults pointing heavenward, feats of engineering powered not by kings alone, but by entire communities raising coin and labor for glory of God. Stained glass windows cast colored light upon worshippers, teaching stories of scripture to those who could not read. Still, war never lay far from daily life. Knights rode in mail and carried lances, bound by oaths of chivalry that spoke of honor, but often yielded bloodshed. Lords clashed over borders, while peasants cowered behind palisades, praying their fields would not burn. Tournaments displayed martial skill in controlled contests. Yet on real battlefields, carnage was anything but ritual. Songs of troubadours praised noble love and heroic valor, masking the harsher realities of conquest and pillage. From the year 1095, new horizons of violence and faith opened. Pope Urban II, speaking at Clermont, called upon warriors to free Jerusalem from Muslim control. His words ignited fervor across Europe. Knights sewed crosses to their tunics, peasants sold possessions, and whole armies of the faithful began the long march eastward. The First Crusade ended with Christian armies breaching the walls of the Holy City, blood filling its streets, both triumph and horror indelibly recorded in chronicles. Crusader states arose along the Levantine coast, fragile outposts defended by castles like Crac de Chevalier. Pilgrims, merchants, and warriors mingled in their markets, trading relics, spices, and silk. For 2 centuries, these enclaves survived precariously, while successive crusades brought waves of warriors from Europe. Though most failed in their ultimate aims, the crusading movement altered the medieval world profoundly. Contact with the East introduced Europeans to sugar, paper, new medicines, and philosophies preserved in Arabic translations. Meanwhile, universities sprouted in European cities: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, centers of learning where students pored over Aristotle in Latin, rediscovered through Arabic intermediaries. Professors lectured beneath vaulted halls. Debates rang out in disputations, and knowledge once nearly lost after the fall of Rome flourished anew. Scholastic thinkers sought to reconcile reason and revelation, laying groundwork for intellectual revolution still centuries away. Not only scholars, but also artisans benefited from exchange. Gothic architecture soared higher with innovations like pointed arches and flying buttresses, techniques likely borrowed and adapted from contacts with Islamic builders. In cathedrals, stone seemed to defy gravity, creating sanctuaries of light where music echoed, incense drifted, and worshippers felt the nearness of heaven. Back in the Islamic world, the Caliphate fractured politically even as its culture thrived. Rival dynasties arose in Spain, Egypt, and Persia, yet Baghdad's influence endured in science, literature, and art. In Cordoba, lamps glowed over libraries said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes. In Cairo, scholars debated law beneath the shadow of minarets. In Samarkand and Bukhara, caravanserais bustled with traders speaking dozens of tongues. By the 13th century, Viking voyages had carried Norsemen as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even the coast of North America. Though their settlements across the Atlantic did not last, sagas preserved memories of lands of grapes and broad meadows. At the same time, merchants from Venice and Genoa ventured east, weaving Italy into the commercial fabric that connected Christendom to the wider world. The medieval centuries were neither wholly dark nor wholly golden. They were an age of contrasts, violence and learning, poverty and splendor, superstition and inquiry. Castles dotted the hills, yet monasteries kept alive ancient wisdom. Peasants lived lives of back-breaking toil, yet cathedrals rose with soaring beauty. Crusades drenched lands in blood, yet also brought cultures into contact that would shape centuries to come. By the end of this era, the stage was set for greater storms. To the east, a vast power gathered on the steppes, horsemen preparing to ride farther than any Viking or Crusader could imagine. Their approach would shake both Christian kingdoms and Islamic caliphates, forging a world more interconnected and more vulnerable than ever before. On the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where grass rolled like waves beneath an endless sky, a child was born with a blood clot in his fist. To his people, this omen promised greatness. That boy, Temujin, would grow into Genghis Khan, the world shaker whose horsemen would knit continents together with fear, trade, and unexpected exchange. Life on the steppe bred resilience. Tribes moved with their herds, carrying felt tents on wagons, living on milk, meat, and the rhythm of seasons. Horses were companions as much as beasts, swift enough to chase prey, hardy enough to endure winter snows. Warriors could ride for days, surviving on dried curds and a swallow of fermented mare's milk, loosing arrows with deadly accuracy even at full gallop. For centuries, these nomads harassed neighboring kingdoms, but under Genghis they became a storm. Temujin's rise was forged in hardship. Betrayed after his father's death, left to starve with his family, he clawed back power by sheer determination. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished without mercy. By uniting rival clans beneath his banner, he transformed a patchwork of feuding tribes into a single force. When he declared himself universal ruler, few could have imagined how far his vision reached. The Mongol onslaught began with thunder across the steppes of northern China. Cities that defied them were encircled, their gates battered by catapults hurling stones, fire, and sometimes diseased corpses. When resistance persisted, walls fell and slaughter followed. Yet those who submitted often found leniency. Merchants, artisans, and scribes were spared, carried westward to enrich new conquests. Conquest was ruthless, but it was also pragmatic. As the empire expanded, horsemen swept into Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Russia. Kiev burned, its churches collapsing in flame. Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasid world, fell in 1258. Its libraries tossed into the Tigris, ink staining the waters black. The Caliph was executed, and with him, a chapter of Islamic civilization ended. Chroniclers across the world recorded terror at an enemy who seemed unstoppable. And yet, paradoxically, the Mongol Empire connected lands as no power had before. Once conquered, trade routes revived. The Silk Road, long dangerous, thrived under Mongol patrols. Caravans carried silks and spices, jewels and medicines, from China to the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants like Marco Polo traveled deep into Asia, astonished at cities of dazzling wealth and order. His descriptions of Kublai Khan's court in China, filled with golden halls and bustling markets, seemed like fantasy to European ears, yet they testified to the cosmopolitan world the Mongols had created. With goods came ideas and technologies. Gunpowder, paper money, and printing traveled westward. Astronomers compared charts across cultures. Doctors studied remedies from distant lands, and craftsmen borrowed designs from neighbors they once considered strangers. Languages mingled in marketplaces where Persian, Arabic, Chinese, and Turkic speakers bartered side by side. For a brief moment, the world felt smaller, bound by the speed of hoofbeats and the will of Khans. But with exchange came disease. Along the same roads that carried silk and spice, plague spread. In the mid-14th century, ships docking in Mediterranean ports carried rats infected with Yersinia pestis. The Black Death swept through Europe, Asia, and North Africa, killing tens of millions. Villages emptied, cities buried their dead in pits, and priests prayed in vain for deliverance. Paradoxically, the very network that made commerce flourish also carried death with terrifying efficiency. In China, the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. He moved the capital to what is now Beijing, building palaces and canals that bound the empire together. He welcomed foreign merchants, tolerated diverse religions, and encouraged exchange. Yet resentment simmered among the Chinese, who saw themselves ruled by outsiders. Revolts eventually brought down the Yuan, but the memory of that era lingered, along with the technologies and connections it had fostered. On the steppes themselves, succession struggles weakened the once united realm. After Genghis, his descendants divided territories into Khanates, Golden Horde in Russia, Ilkhanate in Persia, Chagatai in Central Asia, Yuan in China. Each pursued its own destiny, sometimes in alliance, often at war. The dream of a single universal empire faded, yet the foundations they laid remained. In Europe, the Mongol presence was fleeting but frightening. Knights who once fought each other stared in disbelief at horsemen who rode circles around them, loosing arrows with precision. At battles like Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary, entire armies crumbled under Mongol assaults. When news reached Paris and Rome, panic spread that no wall or fortress could resist them. Only the death of the great Khan in Karakorum pulled the invaders back, sparing Western Europe from further devastation. Still, the Mongols were not remembered solely for destruction. Diplomatic letters survive, sent to popes, kings, and princes seeking alliances or demanding submission. Envoys traveled thousands of miles, carrying not only threats, but gifts, knowledge, and news of distant lands. A new awareness of the world dawned. Maps expanded, borders grew porous, and travelers began to imagine connections between civilizations once thought unreachable. In Persia, poets like Rumi and Hafiz composed verses even under Mongol rule, their mystical lines enduring long after the Khanates dissolved. In China, theatre and novels flourished, new art forms blending Mongol, Chinese, and Islamic influences. In Russia, centuries of domination left deep marks on political life, while in the Middle East, the fall of Baghdad reshaped Islamic authority forever. The Mongol storm was brief in historical terms, yet its force altered everything it touched. It destroyed cities but revived trade, slaughtered multitudes but connected continents, carried plague but also ideas that enriched humanity. By the time the empire fractured, the world was changed. No longer a collection of isolated civilizations, but a web of connections stretched across deserts, seas, and mountains. What began on the steppe with a boy holding a clot of blood ended as the first true global age. The thundering hooves faded, but the bridges they built of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange remained. The world would never again be wholly separate. In Italian cities, where narrow streets opened into bustling piazzas, a new spirit took root. Merchants counted coins from trade with the East. Bankers scribbled figures in ledgers. And painters sketched visions inspired not only by faith, but by the human form itself. Florence, Venice, and Milan hummed with energy. Out of their workshops and palaces emerged the Renaissance, a rebirth that looked back to Greece and Rome, yet sought to surpass them with new brilliance. Florence thrived under patrons such as the Medici, who supported painters, sculptors, and scholars. Above it all, Brunelleschi lifted the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a masterpiece that appeared to float over the skyline. Botticelli painted figures of myth with a delicacy that made Venus herself appear reborn from the sea. Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with designs of flying machines and dissections of the human body, while Michelangelo carved marble into living flesh, his David staring defiantly into the future. Printing spread these ideas farther than any artist alone could reach. Gutenberg's press, first in Mainz and then across Europe, multiplied texts by the thousands. No longer were books treasures chained in monasteries. Now merchants, students, and priests could purchase knowledge. Pamphlets spread arguments, maps carried explorers' visions, and Bibles reached households that once had only listened in church pews. The information revolution cracked open old certainties. At the same time, empires beyond Europe reached new heights. In Anatolia, Ottoman sultans commanded vast armies. Mehmet the Conqueror breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453, his cannons pounding ancient stone until the great city fell. Hagia Sophia, once a church, became a mosque, its dome echoing with Arabic prayers. The Ottomans soon ruled from the Balkans to the Middle East, their janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, striking fear on battlefields across 3 continents. In Persia, the Safavids created a realm of dazzling mosques and silk trade, while in India, the Mughal emperors blended Persian, Turkish, and Indian traditions. Babur founded the dynasty, but it was Akbar the Great who expanded it into a vast empire, tolerant of many faiths and rich in culture. His descendants built gardens, palaces, and the Taj Mahal, white marble shimmering beneath the sun as a monument to love and power alike. While gunpowder transformed battles in Asia, the oceans opened new frontiers for Europe. Portuguese ships hugged the coast of Africa, their sails filled with Atlantic winds. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape and reached India, carrying spices back to Lisbon that enriched a kingdom overnight. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under Spanish banners, crossed the Western Ocean. He believed he had reached Asia, but instead he encountered islands of the Caribbean and peoples unknown to Europe. The meeting of worlds was catastrophic and transformative. Spanish conquistadors marched through Mexico and Peru, bringing down the Aztec and Inca empires with steel, horses, and disease. Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, marveling at its canals and markets, before its temples ran red with blood. Pizarro captured Atahualpa in Cajamarca, seizing the Inca's golden ransom before executing him. Yet the deadliest conqueror was invisible: smallpox. It swept through the Americas, killing up to 90% of the population, leaving cities silent and empires hollow. From this devastation arose the Columbian Exchange. Horses thundered across American plains, reshaping native life. Maize and potatoes sailed eastward, feeding populations from Ireland to China. Coffee and sugar plantations spread across the tropics, worked by enslaved Africans carried across the Atlantic in chains. The triangle of trade, guns and goods to Africa, captives to the New World, silver and crops to Europe, redrew the map of human life. Cultural mingling followed conquest. In Mexico, cathedrals rose on the ruins of temples, their bells ringing over plazas where Spanish and indigenous traditions fused. In the Andes, Quechua hymns blended with Catholic prayers. Across the Caribbean, African drums beat alongside European lutes, new rhythms carried on the wind. Colonization was brutal, but it also created worlds of unexpected synthesis. Europe itself reeled from transformation. Gold and silver from the New World flooded markets, fueling both prosperity and inflation. Monarchs sponsored explorers competing for colonies. Rivalries spilled into wars, fought not only on European fields but also on distant coasts. Seaborne empires grew, their sails darkening horizons from Brazil to the Philippines. Still, even as Europe expanded outward, it looked inward. Scholars challenged ancient authorities, using telescopes and experiments to question the cosmos. Copernicus proposed that the Earth itself moved around the Sun. Galileo confirmed it through lenses pointed at Jupiter's moons, and explorers of the sky clashed with guardians of tradition. Knowledge was no longer confined to scripture. It now came from observation, calculation, and daring imagination. Gunpowder, compass, and press, three inventions that had traveled from China through the Islamic world, reshaped Europe into something new. Cannons brought down castle walls, ending the age of medieval fortresses. Navigational tools guided ships across oceans. Printing spread radical ideas faster than rulers could suppress them. Old worlds collapsed, new ones were born. By the 16th century, the globe itself was connected. Silver from Potosi funded wars in Europe and purchases in China. Manila galleons carried silk across the Pacific, linking Asia to the Americas. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English fleets competed to dominate oceans, while inland empires like the Ottomans and Mughals continued to flourish on land. The Renaissance had begun as a rebirth of ancient wisdom, yet it unleashed forces its thinkers could never have imagined. A thirst for knowledge led to discovery, discovery to conquest, conquest to global exchange. In Florence, painters mixed pigments. In Lisbon, sailors charted new coasts. In Tenochtitlan, the clash of civilizations echoed through temples and plazas. Together, they formed a world no longer divided into isolated continents, but bound into a single, turbulent system. The stage was set for revolutions of faith, science, and politics. The Age of Discovery and the Gunpowder empires had remade the map. The centuries ahead would remake the very foundations of thought and power. By candlelight, scholars leaned over pages traced with stars, tumbling weights, and designs for unheard-of machines. Their quills scratched not poetry, but formulas. What began in observation of the heavens soon shook thrones and altars alike. The early modern world was a crucible of upheaval, where faith, science, and politics collided, reshaping societies from Europe to the colonies overseas. In the 16th century, Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door in Wittenberg. His defiance of indulgences spread swiftly, thanks to the printing press. Pamphlets poured from presses by the thousands, carried by merchants and students into every corner of the continent. Within months, farmers were debating theology in taverns, and rulers were choosing sides. The Reformation fractured Christendom. Lutheran princes in Germany, Calvinists in Geneva, Anglicans in England. Catholic monarchs struck back with their own reforms and inquisitions. Wars of religion ignited, and Europe bled for more than a century. Still, conflict did not silence curiosity. In Florence, Galileo raised a telescope to the night sky and saw mountains on the moon, moons circling Jupiter, and countless stars invisible to the naked eye. And yet it moves, he muttered of the earth, even as inquisitors demanded silence. In England, Isaac Newton described the laws that bound planets and apples alike, weaving mathematics into a fabric of universal order. Knowledge that once belonged only to God's mystery was now revealed through human reason. Coffeehouses became the new forums of debate. In London and Paris, men gathered over steaming cups, exchanging pamphlets, newspapers, and arguments. Here, merchants discussed prices alongside philosophers pondering liberty. In one corner, John Locke described government as a contract between ruler and ruled. In another, Voltaire railed against superstition, with wit as sharp as any blade. The Enlightenment was not confined to lecture halls. It thrived in smoky rooms where ordinary tradesmen might overhear ideas once reserved for kings. Meanwhile, global commerce bound continents tighter. Across the Atlantic, enslaved Africans were driven onto ships, their chains rattling beneath decks as winds carried them westward. In the Americas, plantations of sugar and tobacco consumed their labor. From Caribbean ports, barrels of molasses and bales of cotton sailed eastward, feeding factories and markets. The triangular trade enriched merchants in Bristol, Bordeaux, and Lisbon, even as it left scars of suffering that would endure for centuries. Colonies became laboratories of empire. In Spanish America, silver from Potosi flowed into European treasuries, funding wars and trade with Asia. English settlers along the Atlantic seaboard carved farms from forests, while French fur traders paddled rivers deep into the interior. Rival empires clashed not only in Europe but across oceans, their wars echoing from Indian ports to Caribbean islands. At home, monarchs grappled with rising wealth and restless subjects. Louis XIV built Versailles, a palace of mirrors where nobles bowed before him in rituals of control. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state, summed his claim to absolute power. Yet even as courtiers flattered him, pamphleteers whispered of liberty and rights. In England, conflict had already spilled into civil war. A king was beheaded in London, Parliament claimed sovereignty, and later monarchs ruled by consent rather than divine decree. The Enlightenment fed revolution, not only in thought, but in deed. Across the Atlantic, colonists bristled at taxes imposed by distant kings. In taverns of Boston and Philadelphia, words of liberty found eager ears. By 1776, they declared independence, announcing that all men were created equal, even as slavery endured in their fields. Muskets fired at Lexington and Yorktown, and a republic was born, the first of its kind in centuries. In France, hunger and debt fueled anger. Philosophers' words mingled with peasants' demands, and the Bastille fell in 1789. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These cries toppled monarchy and unleashed terror. Heads rolled beneath the guillotine, while armies marched under new banners, declaring war on kings across Europe. Out of the chaos would rise Napoleon, but the revolution had already proven that thrones could fall to the will of common people. Meanwhile, the scientific spirit spread beyond astronomy and physics. Naturalists sailed with explorers, cataloguing plants and animals. Linnaeus arranged species in careful hierarchies, while explorers carried seeds across continents, altering diets and landscapes. In chemistry, new elements were discovered. In medicine, experiments pushed against ancient authority. Each breakthrough whispered the same message. The world was knowable, and knowledge could be shared. States, driven by mercantilist thought, battled for dominance in wealth and markets. Colonies provided raw goods, home countries manufactured products, and navies enforced monopolies. Wars became contests not just for borders, but for markets, whether in Caribbean, sugar islands, Indian ports, or the coasts of Africa. Power was measured in fleets, factories, and bullion, as much as in castles or cathedrals. By the end of the 18th century, the old world was transformed. Thrones still stood, but their foundations trembled. Churches still rang bells, but reason spoke with a louder voice. Printing presses clattered, ships crossed oceans, and revolutionaries sharpened ideas sharper than any sword. The early modern era had bound continents together, unleashed new sciences, and planted the seeds of revolutions that would define the centuries ahead. Smoke thickened over factory towns where chimneys spat fire into the skies. The 19th century dawned with a new rhythm. Steam, coal, and iron driving machines that roared louder than rivers or wind. Villages became cities in a single generation, their streets crowded with workers who rose before dawn to labor in mills. On the rails, locomotives screamed like restless beasts, binding together nations and shrinking landscapes. Telegraph wires hummed with messages sent faster than horses could ever ride. The Industrial Revolution transformed not only economies, but the very shape of life. Families that once tilled fields now crowded into tenements, sharing water pumps and narrow alleys. Disease thrived in the filth, yet so did innovation. Gas lamps lit the nights, newspapers circulated by the millions, and new inventions promised progress without end. For the first time in history, humanity bent nature to its machines on a massive scale. With this came new powers. Germany, forged under Bismarck's iron hand, rose from scattered states into a formidable empire. Italy, too, united after centuries of division, its red-shirted patriots carrying banners of freedom. In the east, Japan transformed with astonishing speed. Samurai laid aside swords for rifles, and railways spread across islands once isolated. Within decades, its fleets could challenge even Western navies. Even so, industry also fed empire. European powers carved Africa into colonies, drawing lines on maps with little thought for the people who lived there. Soldiers in pith helmets marched inland with rifles, while missionaries raised crosses beside trading posts. India became the jewel in the crown of Britain's empire, its railways built for commerce, its wealth drained for distant masters. Imperialism reshaped the world, creating connections that brought spices, cotton, and tea to European tables, along with resentment and resistance that would simmer for generations. Amid this, voices rose for justice. The abolition of slavery spread from Britain to the Americas, though not without blood. Workers formed unions, demanding shorter hours and fairer pay. Women campaigned for suffrage, standing outside parliaments with banners and chants. social struggles marked the century as surely as inventions, proving that progress was not only about machines, but about dignity. The 20th century, however, shattered optimism. In 1914, gunfire echoed across Europe. Armies marched with banners of glory, believing war would end quickly. Instead came trenches, mud, barbed wire, and machine guns mowing down thousands in minutes. Poison gas drifted over no man's land, shells cratered fields once fertile, and whole generations vanished into the earth. By 1918, empires lay in ruins. The Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Romanovs, all swept away. Millions mourned, and though the war was called great, it brought only grief. Peace proved fragile. Economic collapse in the 1930s left cities lined with the hungry and unemployed. In desperation, new ideologies rose. Fascist leaders promised revival through discipline and violence. In Germany, Adolf Hitler turned resentment into fury, scapegoating minorities and arming for conquest. In Italy and Japan, similar ambitions took root. Democracies faltered as the drums of war beat again. The Second World War dwarfed the first in scale and horror. Blitzkrieg lightning strikes toppled nations in weeks. The Holocaust murdered millions in camps where smokestacks rose over silent fields. Battles raged from deserts of Africa to jungles of Asia. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Blinding light, firestorms, and shadows burned into stone. Civilization had found the means to annihilate itself. The old world lay in ashes, and from it, a new order emerged. Two superpowers dominated, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their rivalry defined decades, though direct conflict never came. Instead, the Cold War unfolded in proxy wars, spies, and an arms race that piled nuclear warheads high enough to destroy the planet many times over. Fear hung over everyday life. Children drilled for fallout. Leaders spoke of deterrence. Yet amid the tension came marvels. The first satellite orbiting Earth, the first human in space, and in 1969, footprints pressed into the dust of the moon. Humanity, divided on Earth, touched the stars together. While the superpowers dueled, empires collapsed. India gained independence, Gandhi's Salt March and hunger strikes proving that non-violence could unseat colonial rule. Across Africa, new nations emerged from the shadow of European powers. Some thrived, others staggered under borders drawn without care for history. Latin America wrestled with dictatorship and democracy alike, while China rose under Mao, convulsed in revolution and reform. Everywhere, societies changed at breathtaking speed. Civil rights movements demanded equality for Black Americans. Women pushed beyond the vote toward broader freedoms. Students filled streets from Paris to Mexico City with cries for change. Culture itself shifted. Jazz, cinema, television, and rock music, crossing borders as swiftly as any army. By century's end, the Soviet Union collapsed, its red flag lowered over the Kremlin. For a moment, it seemed one model of society had triumphed. The United States stood unchallenged, globalization surged, and new technologies promised connection without limit. The internet spread like wildfire, linking homes, schools, and offices into a single web. Messages that once took weeks to cross oceans now flashed in seconds. The 21st century opened with triumph and terror. Towers fell in New York on a September morning. Flames and smoke seared into memory. Wars followed in Afghanistan and Iraq, while terrorism reshaped politics worldwide. In 2008, a financial crisis shook global markets, proving the world's interdependence could spread panic as easily as prosperity. In 2020, a pandemic brought cities to silence, emptying streets and grounding plains, yet also highlighting human resilience, as scientists produced vaccines with unprecedented speed. At the same time, achievements astonished. Smartphones placed libraries and maps into every pocket. Spacecraft explored Mars and beyond. Medical advances extended lives once thought short. Wind and solar power offered hope against the warming climate, even as glaciers melted and seas rose. Billions of voices, once isolated by geography, now debated, argued, and dreamed together on digital platforms. Humanity had never been so connected or so aware of its fragility. Today, civilization stands at a precipice. The tools we wield, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nuclear power, carry both salvation and peril. Inequality, war, and environmental strain threaten stability, yet collaboration across borders offers glimpses of what might be achieved. Our species has traveled from stone tools and cave fires to satellites circling Earth and telescopes peering into distant galaxies. The story has not ended, but in the sweep from the first footprints in African soil to footprints on the moon, from tribal councils to global institutions, from myths whispered by firelight to data shared in an instant, one truth endures. Humanity's greatest creation is not merely cities, machines, or empires. It is civilization itself, a fragile, wondrous fabric woven across millennia, sustained by memory, struggle, and hope. And its future, as always, rests in the hands of those who live it.